Because many Southern historians view the Civil War through rose-colored glasses, the cause of Southern Unionism has been greatly overlooked. Now, buried behind me are 6 men who were executed for being members of the 1st Georgia State Volunteers, a Unionist regiment mustered into service in late October 1864. Now, if you want to look at the numbers, 3,000 men from Alabama, 5,000 from North Carolina, a whopping 42,000 from Tennessee, and only 400 from Georgia joined Unionist regiments. Now, the reason for this disparity is because East Tennessee was basically occupied by the Union Army from the very start of the war. So if you were a Unionist, you had established lines, and if you were a Unionist, for example, in North Georgia, you could make your way through the valleys and up the creeks into East Tennessee and just muster into service there. However, the men who joined in Georgia, their battalion was only 400 strong after Sherman was already in Atlanta. A lot of these men were more indecisive, and they didn't want to leave their families up until the Union was knocking on their front door. And others actually joined during the Battle of Atlanta when they realized that all was lost. So many people in the Deep South came to regard these Union troops as turncoats, as people who were traitors lacking honor. And so when they were captured, they were afforded very ill treatment and often quickly executed. But the presence of these great bands of Unionists up in the Appalachian Mountains is indicative of something greater. Basically, the Confederate government was very authoritarian. They demanded a high tax rate, and when you couldn't get it, they would go and raid your house and requisition what they needed to feed troops in the local area. And this caused very ill feelings among many people in Appalachia who were living hand to mouth. Of course, most of them joined earlier in the war in East Tennessee, but men like the ones who were executed and buried behind me joined only when the Union was knocking on their front door because they had their families to feed. And here you have the executed 1st Georgia State Troop Volunteers. All men from Georgia, all men who joined the Union. 1st Sergeant Milton Nix, Private Daniel Blackwell, Jordan Stone, Thomas Payne, Charles Whittlemore, and John Reed. November 7th, 1864. William Edmondson was one of many Confederate soldiers who defected to the Union Army and were later executed when caught in October 1864. He appears to have actually fought under John Bell Hood at the Battle of Peachtree Creek in Atlanta, and later joined an Eastern Tennessee Union regiment, because the most common Union regiment to join for Southerners who wished to defect was Tennessee. Likewise, Thomas Edmond was a member of the Company D 52nd Georgia Confederate Infantry before he defected and joined the Union Army in the latter stages of the war. Zach Brooks, real name Aaron Thacker Brooks, was born in western North Carolina in the Appalachian region in around 1840, and for a while he was in the 8th Georgia Confederate Battalion before joining the Georgia Volunteer Infantry, a Union regiment which had very few troops. And there's someone else in the cemetery buried that I'd like to show you who actually wrote about the rebels in North Georgia, who were mainly, at that point, they were doing rearguard actions to protect Sherman and his men as they marched to the sea, but he wrote about them because of the negative reputation they'd received after the war, and certainly growing up, even in Georgia history, they never talked about these men. Sergeant Sion Darnell actually wrote a little bit about the 1st Georgia State Volunteers after the Civil War was over and became kind of a public mouthpiece for them because, as you can hear from my last video, it's kind of obvious how easy it was to view these men as turncoats, people who joined very late in the war and mainly got away from all the battles, but they were guerrillas in the North Georgia mountains. They were called the Forgotten Band of Guerrillas, and so he kind of came to their cause and wrote a little bit about them. He, like I said in the other video, joined a Tennessee regiment in late 1864 and came to know the Georgia Unionists quite well. Several of the executed men are actually buried. If you want to see where this is in the cemetery, kind of just down here in section E. A new sign in front of the old Dawsonville courthouse is finally commemorating Georgia Unionists in the Civil War. After federal troops entered the state in 1864, a volunteer infantry battalion, also known as the 1st Georgia State Troop Volunteers, was created. The reason why so many people, black and white alike, joined this unit is because, one, they wanted pay that was more stable, and two, the Confederate government was very authoritarian and they demanded high taxation. Now, this didn't fly in remote parts of rural North Georgia. In fact, a lot of resistance to the Confederacy came from the poorest areas of Appalachia, areas like eastern Tennessee, Mississippi, central northern Alabama, and this unit was very ephemeral. It was mustered out of service at this courthouse in 1865. In the main cemetery overlooking downtown Dahlonega is the empty grave of Eiley Stewart, who, along with two of his friends on October 22, 1864, was taken out of town and summarily shot without any trial. And this was a forgotten war crime, and furthermore testament to the fact that there was a civil war operating within the normal Civil War. Now, Confederate authorities realized in 1862, early 1863, that the poor farmers up here in Appalachia had a lot of Union sympathies. And even when they didn't have these Union sympathies, a lot of them would go up and join Union forces because they paid better, they clothed them better, and it would be as easy as going up over the mountain range and sending supplies back to your family. Of course, this created a lot of tension up here in North Georgia when a lot of people who supported the Confederacy would see families of Unionists and drive them out of town. Now, by the late 1862 era, there was talk of organizing a force of Confederate Home Guard that would come up to Dahlonega and root these people out. So in January 1863, the son of famed Robert E. Lee, who was himself a colonel, sent out a dispatch of about 500 Confederate Home Guard, and they rampaged through the countryside. Now, this had the opposite of the desired effect. A lot of people, of course, when you declare martial law and you increase taxes and you requisition cows to feed your own troops, of course people turned against the Confederacy. And particularly in Fannin County, people remained neutral when they could, and they joined the Union when they dared. Now, at that point in time, Atlanta was already in ruins, and Sherman and his men were a little bit further south. So behind those lines, you had a lot of bushwhacking, a lot of basically waylaying and lawlessness. So when they caught these three men in a group of 8, the rest escaped, they brought them to the county jail. It's now the Gold Museum of Dahlonega, and they chained them up in the basement. But the judge wasn't in town. It was a remote region of North Georgia, so he was actually out on a circuit. They were just taken out and summarily shot. Now, the Confederates viewed them at the time as just lawless criminals, not realizing that they had 3 men who were uniformed members of the Tennessee Mountain Cavalry. These were actual soldiers, and any trial would have revealed this. Eiley Stewart and the 2 men who were executed alongside him were born up here in North Georgia, and at the time were taking volunteer positions at cavalry camps around Athens, Tennessee, which was controlled by the Union. Now, when they were let out, they were not told what was going to happen, but they must have figured it out pretty soon because they blindfolded them, tied them together, put them on the back of a horse, and brought them down here to Soldier's Path. And this is actually quite a distance away from the main courthouse where they were held, so they must have realized as they headed out into the hills what awaited them. And it's said that their bodies are still buried out here in some creek bed or valley, and they're now underneath a sandstone grave, but at least a monument stands for Eiley Stewart in the local cemetery. But they did find on them a list of sympathetic Georgia men who wanted to join the 1st Georgia Volunteers, a Union regiment. And because Atlanta was in ruins, and because, of course, everybody viewed them as traitors, especially because of the violent actions in Atlanta, there was a lot of anger. And these men were taken and summarily executed a few weeks later. And these are the 6 graves that you now see in Marietta National Cemetery. And you can actually see that Eiley T. Stewart, who was part of the 5th Tennessee Mounted Infantry, someone has come along and removed the Confederate flag from his grave. And if you wanted to join the Union Army, there it was, right beyond that mountain range. The Harris family here actually dates back to early pioneers in Dahlonega, because you can see on the right, John Martin Harris was a private in Lindsay's regiment of the Georgia Mounted Militia during the Indian Wars. These guys would have been helping in the Cherokee removal of the 1830s. Somewhere behind me on private property in Pike County, Georgia, is the final resting place of Peter Cantrell, who was executed on July 22, 1864, by the infamous Jordan Gang, said to have killed 140 people without any recognition or commission from the state of Georgia. Now, before I go into the death of Cantrell, I wanted to talk a little bit about the nature of this second civil war within a civil war in North Georgia. So Colonel Lee, General Lee's son, arrived in Dahlonega around January 1863 and wrote in his journals that 1 in 3 Confederate soldiers in the region had defected and joined the Union voluntarily. Now, of course, later historians would say that these men had abandoned an honorable cause and had no allegiance, but Lee, in his contemporary accounts, actually said that yes, many of these men were Unionists, and most of them, however, didn't really have any problem with either side. They just wanted to be left alone to tend for their families. But in come these 500 men under Lee, declaring martial law in early 1863 and forcing these young boys, as young as 16, to leave their families' farms to act as militiamen in the local region. But Lee realized that he wouldn't be able to deal with them with his 500 troops, so he allowed the formation of these gangs. Sometimes Home Guard units were given official state recognition, but many times they weren't, and the most infamous were the McCollum Gang and the Jordan Gang, also called the Cherokee Scouts. Peter Cantrell, in fact, was executed for returning to his family as a wounded Confederate militiaman, simply trying to see how they were doing and bring them a little bit of food, but when the Jordan Gang found out he was in the local area, they shot him in the back. And it's said that the Jordan Gang killed 140 people in a similar manner. Now, nobody from the Jordan Gang or the McCollum Gang was arrested after the war, but both men died before their time. McCollum became a lawyer in Georgia and was later shot by one of his defendants, and the Jordan brothers were both killed in bar brawls in Texas and in Florida. So you can see that the experiences these men had in the war often led them to live short, violent, and brutal lives and die early deaths.